The sun was just beginning to rise, and it was still quite quiet outside. In the small house, in the kitchen, an old woman was struggling to move. Her hands trembled slightly with pain, and her joints reminded her of her age, and every step was difficult. Mercedes was already 82, and although she was still trying to keep her spirits up, each day reminded her more and more that the years were taking their toll. She was on the brink, but as always, she kept fighting. She had a heavy bucket of water in her hands, and despite the pain, she persevered and tried to lift it. It was her morning task that she had gotten from Talia, her sister-in-law. And she knew that if she didn't do it, it would only get worse. Talia stood at the door, leaning against the jamb, with the same smile that radiated equanimity and contempt. She watched as Mercedes struggled to complete her next task. Things were not going well for her, every day was harder and harder. But Talia wasn't the kind of person who was used to pity. She was waiting for the moment to not just control, but break her unwilling servant. "Well, mother, slow again?" Her sarcastic voice sounded. "Are you incapable of working properly at all? Even a turtle is faster than you." Mercedes felt her eyes fill with tears, but she held back. Not now. Not in front of her. Not in front of this woman who made her life hell. Almost done, she whispered with difficulty as she carefully lowered the bucket, feeling the tension in her body increase with each movement. She looked up and saw how pleased Talia was, her smile growing more and more mocking. Mercedes could tell her son everything, but what if he didn't believe her? What if Talia found a way to turn things around again? In this house, every day was like a battle, and she always seemed to lose. Fear and pain stirred in her chest, but she clenched her teeth and set to work again. At that moment, footsteps were heard outside the door. It was her son, Augustin. He had returned from work, and in that moment Talia's face changed instantly. She was back to being the sweet and caring wife everyone knew and loved. It was as if no cruelty and contempt existed, and it happened every chance it got. "Augustin, you have come!" she exclaimed fondly, instantly putting aside all her evil thoughts. "You have no idea how much I missed you. Your mother and I were just preparing a surprise dinner for you." Mercedes watched the scene that was playing out before her eyes. Augustin, his face shining with happiness, was completely oblivious to what was going on behind his back. He walked up to his mother, kissed her on the cheek, and everything was as it always was. "How are you, Mom? Are you okay?" he asked, inquiring about her well-being. But before Mercedes could answer, Talia stepped in. "Oh, darling, don't worry," she said with love in her voice, "your mom is just a little tired. I told her to rest, but she persists as always." Mercedes felt her heart squeeze. She wanted to tell the truth, but each time her voice faded away, consumed by fear and doubt. What if she was wrong? What if it only felt that way to her? But every day was worse and worse. Talia wasn't just making her work. She threatened, she made her feel insignificant, and worst of all, she manipulated everyone around her. "Come on, Mom," Augustin said, "don't work so hard, get some rest. I'll take care of things with Talia." Mercedes only nodded silently, feeling her world shrink into an iron vice. All she could do was remain silent. She knew that if she revealed the truth, Talia would do anything to send her to a nursing home. And then she would lose not only her home, but her son. And no matter how hard Mercedes tried to pull herself together, no matter how hard she tried to talk, she couldn't escape this nightmare. She didn't have the strength to fight, and she was ready to give up. But at that moment, something happened. Talia's voice grew louder, and there was a threat in her words, hidden behind a smile. "Mom, you're not going to complain, are you? We're all doing our best for you. So why make a scene? You don't want things to go wrong, do you?" Mercedes froze. It was as if her whole life depended on this moment. What would she choose? How would she get out of this? Mercedes felt her body freeze and something heavy like a rock closed in her chest. Her thoughts were racing, trying to find a single word that could break this vicious cycle. But her voice was traitorously silent. She looked at her son, and there was nothing but concern in his eyes. How could this be? How could she have fallen into such a trap? Talia noticed her silence and smirked. She knew her plan was working. Every day she was more and more in control of the situation. She watched Mercedes like an obedient dog that had once been free but was now dependent on her whims. Talia's smile became even more sly as she said softly, "You do realize, Mommy, that if something happens, no one will take all these complaints seriously. And if you don't like to work so much, maybe you should think of another place to live." Mercedes felt a cold sweat run down her body. She knew that Talia had been ready to let her into the old people's shelter for a long time, if she ever dared to complain. But what if she managed to find a way out? She never thought there would come a time when her own son might become her enemy without even realizing it. Augustin stood there, unaware of the humiliation and pain his mother was enduring. He thought Talia took perfect care of him, of the house, and that she was the best wife anyone could wish for. Talia was his ideal, and he would never have believed what was really going on in their home. "Mom, really, you need to get more rest. Talia will take care of everything, though," he said, as if just repeating his wife's words. He didn't see her soul slowly shrinking with pain and loneliness. And then, at that moment, when Mercedes thought all was lost, when her feelings and thoughts were like a broken mirror, suddenly something inside her exploded. She couldn't stay silent any longer. She couldn't. With difficulty, but she whispered, "Augustin, I can't live like this anymore. Talia is destroying me, she's destroying me." At that moment, there was something in her voice that made Augustin freeze. But before he could say anything, Talia intervened as always, rattling off her phrases full of concern and fake compassion. "Oh, darling, don't listen to her, she's just tired. You know how she is when there's too much to do. Don't worry, I'll take care of her," Talia said, not letting Augustin even think about what was really behind those words. Mercedes felt her heart clench. Everything she'd said drained away like water into a void. Talia regained control again. She did it without a single effort, like a skilled manipulator. Augustin, as always, didn't notice his mother being consumed by fear and pain, how she gradually disappeared from his life, leaving no trace. But in that moment, as Talia turned Augustin toward her to discuss something in her usual manner, Mercedes felt a spark ignite in her chest. A spark that could turn into fire. She had to do something or her life would remain in this woman's hands. "Wait, Augustin, wait," she said with such firmness that she was even surprised herself. "I can't keep quiet anymore. Talia, she makes me work 12 hours a day. She threatens me. She won't give me food or rest." Talia, hearing those words, turned around abruptly. Her face turned pale and her eyes lit up with anger. She took a step toward Mercedes, but she didn't back down. "Are you out of your mind?" Talia exclaimed, her voice full of threat. "You can't say that. You have no right. You're an elderly woman who owes me a debt of gratitude for sheltering you." Augustin stood there, not realizing what was happening. He couldn't believe his ears. "Mom, is it true?" he asked, but there was no surprise in his voice, only confusion. He wanted to believe it, but he couldn't. Mercedes looked up at him. And there was more than pain in her eyes. There was something more, the certainty that if she didn't say everything she had accumulated now, her life would be over. One way or another. "Yes, Augustin. It's true. Talia, she's destroying me." Talia picked up the phone, and Mercedes felt the cold fear engulf her again. She knew that if Talia made up her mind, she wouldn't stop. But maybe things would change now. And that spark in her chest would turn into a flame. Augustin froze, his face pale. He didn't know what to do. Thoughts swirled in his head as if a door had opened in front of his eyes, and behind it lay a whole other world, a world he never wanted to enter. His mother, who he had known all his life, was suddenly in a different light, a world of pain and fear he knew nothing about. Talia, clutching the phone in her hands as if preparing to summon help, abruptly interrupted the silence. "You dare accuse me?" Her voice wasn't just angry, it was cold as ice, and there was a threat hidden behind the perfectly constructed words. "You don't realize how much I've done for you. You don't know how hard it is for me with this old man who can only complain and not understand. You just don't see the big picture." She stepped forward, forcing Mercedes to back away, and squared her shoulders again, her gaze growing more and more menacing. "You don't want your mom to end up in a nursing home again, do you? You remember how they treat her there, don't you?" Her words were like sizzling arrows aimed at my heart. Augustin looked at her dumbfounded and turned to his mother. His gaze was full of doubt and fear. He didn't know what to think. He didn't know what to do. He had always believed in Talia, believed that she was the one woman he could build a happy life with. And now his world was crumbling right before his eyes. "Mom, his voice trailed off, but he couldn't finish. He didn't know what to say, what to answer to believe what was happening. Mercedes felt tears come to her eyes. Her heart was beating like it was about to burst out and her breathing became heavy. But she didn't back down. She felt that if she didn't tell the truth now, she would lose everything. She couldn't let her son continue to live in this ignorance. "Augustin, I can't stay silent any longer," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I can't go on living like this. It's not a life. It's a nightmare. Talia doesn't care about me. She's destroying me." Talia, who hadn't expected this turn, frowned. She felt her control begin to crumble like sand between her fingers. Something dangerous appeared in her eyes, something that resembled rage. "Are you out of your mind, old woman?" she exclaimed, raising her hand as if ready to make a move to punish. "You think who's going to believe you, huh? Are you out of your mind?" But Mercedes didn't back down. She couldn't. She had to tell everything, every last detail, or she'd drown in this nightmare. "I'm not crazy, Talia," she answered firmly, despite the fear that was tearing her up inside. "I can tolerate it, but I can't stand to watch you manipulate everyone around me, how you make me work while I can barely stand on my feet, how you take everything I have from me." Augustin, turning around, noticed the look in her eyes. Deep, full of pain and finally the truth. And though his heart didn't want to believe that his beloved wife, whom he had known for so many years, could be like this sincerity in his mother's eyes made him doubt his perception. "Mother, do you really think so?" he asked, feeling his world begin to crumble. Talia clenched her fists and threw a look full of venom at Mercedes. "You know that if you start your games now, things are only going to get worse for you, don't you?" she hissed, her eyes full of menace, ready to sizzle. "You can say whatever you want, but I'll always find a way to put you back where you belong." Mercedes could feel her strength draining away, but she knew it was now or never. If she didn't say everything, if she didn't open Augustin's eyes, she would just disappear. And it didn't matter what she'd been through, it only mattered what she did now. "I'm not afraid," she said, pulling herself together. "I can't be silent anymore, Augustin. If I die, you have only yourself to blame." Talia took a step forward, her fingers clenched, ready to lunge into action at any moment, but her gaze stopped suddenly. She saw her neighbor, an older woman with whom Mercedes had exchanged a few words before, come out from behind the door into the kitchen. And the woman was holding a cell phone. "Are you out of your mind?" sharply asked the neighbor, breaking the silence. "I heard everything. Everything. Don't you dare hide anything else. I wrote it all down, and that will be the proof." At that moment Mercedes felt her chest fill with air, as if she had breathed for the first time in a long time. A glimmer of realization finally appeared in her son's eyes. Augustin stood there, unable to believe what he had just heard. His world felt like it had been turned upside down, and it was impossible to comprehend how everything could have fallen apart so quickly. His mother's words, Talia's words, and even this unexpected note from the neighbor, it was all too much for him. He nervously closed his eyes and tried to focus, but his entire perception was distorted. Did you write it down? He whispered, unable to get anything more out of himself. The neighbor, an older woman with kind eyes, nodded, not taking her eyes off Talia. Her face was serious, but there was something like relief in her eyes. Finally someone was telling the truth. She brought the phone closer to her and jabbed her finger at the screen. I heard everything, she said quietly but firmly. Did you think no one would notice? I wasn't going to interfere, but when I saw the way she was treating you, I decided I couldn't keep quiet. Talia froze. Her face turned pale, and she instantly assessed the situation. She took a step back, but her gaze was full of rage. Mercedes couldn't help but notice how Talia felt her overbearing manipulations losing their power. No longer could she simply turn the conversation into a joke and show her perfect wife who was comfortable being manipulated. You, old woman, have no right to interfere, Talia wheezed, her voice shaking with restrained anger. What, you think your video is going to change anything? You don't know who you're messing with. The neighbor wasn't scared. She was willing to stand her ground. All she had to do was show Talia that she could no longer manipulate people as she pleased. You can't keep bullying me, the neighbor replied, putting her hands firmly on her hips. I wrote it all down, and if you continue, I'll give it to Augustin. He needs to know the truth. Augustin, with his hands in his pockets, didn't know what to do. Everything was jumbled up in his head. He turned to his mother and said with a hazy look. Mother, I didn't know. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. Mercedes felt tears come to her eyes. Finally, after all these years, her son was beginning to understand. But there was no room in her heart for joy. She knew there would be more struggles ahead, and those struggles would not end so easily. Talia could no longer hide her rage. She was silent, but her every look, her every movement said that she was willing to do anything to not let the exposure go without consequences. You think that's going to save you? Her voice was cold as ice. Don't think I'm going to let it go. You don't realize what I can do. And then Mercedes felt her heart squeeze once more. She couldn't wait any longer. She couldn't live in this house where she was threatened, where she no longer felt like part of the family. All she needed was to be free, to somehow regain her freedom. Augustin, I can't stay here anymore, she said, her voice full of determination. I can't live under this pressure. I'm leaving. Augustin flinched as if he had been hit. He looked at his mother, and something in his eyes changed. Suddenly everything that seemed normal to him wasn't so normal. He couldn't believe that his beloved wife could be so cruel. But now he was faced with a choice: protect his mother or stay with the woman who had probably manipulated him all his life. Talia, noticing his hesitation, stepped forward. You can't leave, her voice sounded threatening. You won't leave me, will you, Augustin? But Augustin, unlike her, was no longer the same. His eyes were no longer blind. He could no longer turn away from the truth. I don't know what to do, he said, his voice shaking from the tearing inside. Mom, I'll be with you. I can't be a part of this anymore. Mercedes felt a relief that seemed to free her from the heavy burden. She wasn't alone. He was with her. And that meant more than any words could say. Talia turned toward them, her face contorted with rage. She couldn't believe that her control over this house was disappearing so easily. She knew this was only the beginning. But now, in this moment, there was nothing she could do. All that was left was a threat. And she made it. You'll pay for this, Talia whispered, her eyes burning with anger. You'll regret everything. But Augustin paid no attention to her. He just stood next to his mother and said quietly, We're leaving. You have no more power here. And despite Talia's threats, they left, leaving her standing in an empty room where all her power and manipulation had suddenly lost its force. Talia tried to hold herself together, but deep down she knew her world had shattered. When the door slammed shut behind Mercedes and Augustin, leaving Talia in an empty room where everything she once thought was hers was slowly crumbling, she couldn't just give up. Anger and rage overwhelmed her, but she had no choice but to turn to her old strategy: manipulate, intimidate, and make everyone around her fear her again. She ran into the next room where the phone stood and dialed a number. Literally seconds later, the answer rang out. "Is that you? Where are you? You've ruined everything again." Talia gritted her teeth, almost roaring into the receiver. "I'll do anything." Her voice shook with rage. "You still owe me. I have everything I need. I'll make sure they both come back to me. You know what I can do." Her words sounded like a threat, and a terrible certainty throbbed in her heart that she could take revenge. But deep down, beneath all the gloating, Talia knew her strength had run out. Now she needed something more to get things back into her own hands. Meanwhile, Mercedes and Augustin found themselves in their neighbor's apartment. It was a small but cozy place, and Mercedes felt her nervous tension finally begin to subside. She sat on the old couch, cuddling a cup of hot tea, and looked out the window. Behind it was her life, her story, her struggles. Augustin sat next to her, but his gaze was still confused. He couldn't believe that his world had turned so suddenly upside down. He still couldn't fully understand how it had happened. He himself didn't know what to do now with the information he had discovered. He had lived with the false notion that Talia was a good woman for so long that it was almost impossible to finally realize the truth. "Mom, I'm so sorry I didn't see all of this sooner. I didn't realize how hard it was for you." His voice was full of remorse. Mercedes smiled slightly, but her eyes remained serious. She hadn't felt so lost in a long time, but deep in her heart she still had hope. He was there for her, and that meant more than all her worries over the years. She couldn't have gotten through all of this without his support. "It's going to be okay, Augustin. You've already taken the first step," she said, looking at him with relief. "You don't have to make excuses. You didn't know, and it's not your fault. We will fight together. And I believe we'll make it through." He looked at her gratefully, but there was worry in his eyes. He still didn't know what to make of the threats Talia had left him. But he knew one thing: now his life would never be the same again. Now that he had seen her true side, he could no longer close his eyes to the truth. But what will happen next? How are we going to stop her? He asked. Mercedes hesitated, trying to collect her thoughts. "We won't fight her directly. She's dangerous, and I know she'll go to any lengths. But we have proof. We need to get it all on record so she can't get away with it. We need to act quickly and, most importantly, smartly." Augustin nodded, realizing that everything up to this point was meaningless if they didn't get the evidence that would help them win this battle. He knew that Talia wouldn't stop, and that she would manipulate everyone to regain control. But he was ready to fight too, and now he had no place to retreat to. At that moment, the phone rang. Mercedes picked up the phone, and her face changed slightly when she saw the number. "It's Talia," she whispered. She decided she couldn't get enough of another round of threats. Augustin sighed. He knew that talking to her now would be a waste of time. But Mercedes decided to answer. She could feel her heart clenching again when she heard her voice. She had long ago lost all sympathy for Talia, but she couldn't just ignore the threats. "What do you want?" Mercedes asked. Her voice was firm, but she still sounded tired in it. Talia on the other end of the line began to speak with that softness that always confused her. "Mom, I'm so worried about you." Her voice was full of fake concern. "I understand what you're going through right now, but if you think everything that happened is going to go away so easily, you're wrong. You know what I'm capable of." But Mercedes didn't give in to her manipulations. Now she knew she didn't have to be afraid of Talia. She's strong, she won't let her life be ruined a second time. "You are no longer in control of my life, Talia. I will no longer be under your control. You will not silence me." Talia was silent for a moment, and then her voice was cold and calculating again. "You'll regret this," she said, and this time there was no falseness in her voice, only a clear desire for revenge. Mercedes disconnected the phone and put it on the table. She looked at Augustin and said, "She won't give up. But we won't give up either. We need to be smart and patient." Augustin nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility fall back on his shoulders. He knew their journey would not be easy. But now he was ready to fight. And not just for his mother. He was fighting for his family. Augustin, despite all his indecision, knew he couldn't back down now. He was willing to do anything to stop this game Talia was playing with them. He knew that in her eyes he was just a toy, and now she had plans for everything he had. But it was important to him to not only get back everything that had been taken from him, but to help his mother get out of this hell that Talia had driven her into. "We can't sit and wait," he said, getting up from his seat and pacing nervously around the room. "We need to move faster. If she decides she has the upper hand, she won't stop. We need to find a way to outsmart her before she outsmarts us." Mercedes, sitting on the couch, sighed quietly. There was no fear in her eyes, only determination. She had already been through so much in her life, and although Talia was a dangerous and cunning woman, she couldn't destroy everything Mercedes had built over the years if she didn't allow herself to be weak. Right now, she was strong. And no matter what happened, she didn't give up. "We have to be prepared for her to try to manipulate us again," Mercedes said, her voice as hard as stone. "But we have one advantage: we know her weaknesses. We know how she thinks. And if we succeed in turning her game upside down, she loses everything." Augustin nodded again, but there was still worry in his eyes. He didn't know how long they could hold their defenses, but one thing was certain: if they didn't act now, their lives would be in Talia's hands. "You're right, Mom," he said, running his hands over his face. "We need proof. But where do we look for them? We can't just find her secrets." Mercedes laughed softly, and her eyes sparkled. She suddenly remembered all the times Talia had tried to cover her tracks, how she often left careless marks, relying on her confidence that no one would uncover her. "She's too sure of herself," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. "She thinks she's in control, but her control is her weakness. We just have to find that moment when she exposes her defenses." Augustin understood. He knew that in order to win, they had to proceed quietly, uncluttered. But how? How could a manipulative woman like Talia be exposed so easily? And then a thought occurred to him. Talia had always sought to manage finances, always sought to control all resources. She relied on money, on her influence. But there was one place she wouldn't easily close: her footprints. That was her biggest weakness. "We need to find her accounts, her transactions," Augustin said, his eyes lighting up. "If we can track her money, we can find all her crimes." Mercedes smiled, proud that her son was finally starting to think like her, strategically. This was their chance. Talia had always thought she was smarter than everyone else, but her greed and desire for money could be her last move. "But we have to be careful, Augustin," Mercedes warned. "Talia knows how to cover her tracks. She'll probably use fake accounts and other people for her manipulations. But I know where to start." Augustin raised his eyebrows, perplexed as to what she meant. "I know she has friends in the financial industry. And one of them, an old acquaintance, used to work with your father. He could help us find information," Mercedes said, her face serious, but there was a sparkle in her eyes that wasn't there before. Augustin took a seat next to his mother. Everything she said made sense. It was a risky move, but it might be the only way to get to the bottom of it. "We'll do it," he said, and his voice was full of determination. "We'll make sure she pays for what she did." Talia, meanwhile, wasn't sitting idly by. She could feel her power slipping away, but she wasn't going to give up that easily. Her life was built on control and she couldn't let anyone, not even her own family, take that away from her. If Augustin and Mercedes were going to expose her, she would do anything to outsmart them. Talia reached out to her old acquaintances, making a few calls, but she didn't realize that her every word was now being recorded and that her old connections were playing against her. While she was weaving her plans, Mercedes and Augustin were already in action. Their strategy was clear and they were preparing for the decisive move. A few days passed and they gathered information. A set of evidence was beginning to take shape, and they were close to foiling her plans. But at the last moment, Talia tried to play it safe, threatening everyone she could use to stop them. "This is war," Talia said to herself as she realized she had been exposed. But in war, the one who isn't afraid to lose everything wins. Meanwhile, Augustin and Mercedes, knowing that they were on the verge of victory, felt that every step was becoming crucial. Although they didn't know what would happen in the next corner, one thing was certain: they could no longer afford to go back. Everything was coming to a climax. Talia stood at the window, looking out at the city at night. Her thoughts were churning, every plan, every word had been carefully thought out, but now everything had changed. She felt her world begin to crumble, that all her manipulations and deceptions on which she had so confidently built her life were no longer working. It wasn't just defeat, it was the real end. She didn't yet know what to do with this knowledge that she had been played against. But one thing was certain: if she didn't react quickly, not only would she lose everything, but she would find herself in the hands of the law. Her connections, her cunning, all of it might not save her. "If they think I'm going to give up, they're wrong," she whispered, clenching her fists as she tried to gather her thoughts. Talia had always been ready to fight, but now it was different. She wasn't sure her old methods would work anymore. And most importantly, now she had no one to confide in. But even in this despair, Talia didn't lose her resolve. She knew she had one more card she could play. She could still arrange a move that would give her strength, as long as she didn't delay. Augustin and Mercedes, meanwhile, were already preparing for the decisive moment. Their plan was almost complete: they had gathered enough evidence to destroy Talia's empire. They knew they had to act quickly now, because any delay could turn out to be their defeat. "We can't let her come to her senses," Augustin said, checking again all the documents and videos they had collected. His eyes burned with determination, and there was a confidence in his voice that he hadn't felt in a long time. He was no longer the man who lived in Talia's shadow, afraid to disappoint her. Now he was ready to face her and win. Mercedes looked at her son, feeling that determination transfer to her as well. She was ready. But there was still fear in her heart, fear that Talia might respond to this move with something more dangerous than they could imagine. But fear no longer controlled her. In that moment, despite all the threats, she felt her power within awaken again. "We will do this, son," she said quietly, but with such force that Augustin looked at her in surprise. "We can't back down. We are too close to victory to give up now." They knew the key moment would be when they met with the police. Before Talia discovered their tracks, they had to act. They didn't just have documents in their hands, they had live witnesses who could tell all about what went on behind the closed doors that Talia had so carefully locked. And so, the next morning, when Talia, completely without expecting it, decided to take back control, everything turned out to be already prepared. Augustin and Mercedes went to the police station to hand over the evidence and confirm everything they had learned. Talia, once she realized her position was becoming vulnerable, made one last move to stop them. She believed she could still turn the tide in her favor. But her actions were not unnoticed. The moment she made the call to her last ally, her words were recorded. "You know what you have to do," she said as she held on to the phone, feeling the tension grow with each word. "This isn't just a game. I'm not going to let them destroy everything I've built." But at that moment, her ally, the very man who had once helped her hide the traces of her crimes, was already at Augustin and Mercedes' side. He gave their tapes to the cops and became the witness who helped break up her last network. "It's over, Talia," he whispered into the phone. "You can't win at this game. They already know everything." Her breath hitched. He'd been a traitor. And now that everything had been exposed, she knew her chances of winning were almost non-existent. Her manipulations and threats no longer worked. Her time had passed. When Talia finally realized that the cops were on their way to her house, her world collapsed completely. She knew that her past mistakes, her desire to control, deceive and manipulate had brought her to this moment. She could no longer hide or escape. But she still had one last chance. She could leave, and somehow try to save herself from imprisonment by fleeing into the unknown. But she knew she no longer had the strength or resources to start again. Augustin and Mercedes stood on the doorstep as the police officers entered the house. Talia was under arrest. She didn't try to escape, her gaze was full of despair, as if she knew her trap had shut itself. All that was left was to get justice. Talia was ready to stand trial. Mercedes and Augustin could finally say they had won, but the fight had been long and painful. The trial wasn't over yet, but for them it was the first step to a new life, a life where they were no longer prisoners, where they could be free. Talia sat in the police cell, her hands firmly secured with handcuffs, and her eyes were hazy, as if she didn't fully realize what had happened. The echoes of the last words she had spoken at the time of her arrest were still ringing in her head. She tried to figure out how she had gotten to this point. Where exactly had she gone wrong? Her life, built on manipulation, threats, and ruthless power struggles, had crumbled so quickly that she hadn't even had time to prepare. But despite everything, she remained calm. Her face remained almost emotionless, and it wasn't so much resentment as disappointment in herself that was tearing her up inside. How could I have believed for so long that I was invincible? She thought. With every minute spent in this small and sullen room, she began to realize that her life had somehow come to a strange end. But still in the back of her mind was the certainty that it was not the end. Talia had always known that she could come back. Even if she was put away, she would find a way. She had never been a woman to give up. Meanwhile, across town, Mercedes and Augustin felt a huge weight finally lifted off their shoulders. They couldn't believe that it was finally over. That nightmare that had become their daily reality was almost behind them. They were happy, but with each new step forward, that happiness was more and more overwhelmed by a sense of relief. Augustin couldn't get rid of the thoughts that kept haunting him. How could he be so blind? How could he not notice all the cruel manipulations that were happening right under his nose? He felt like a fool for believing Talia for so long, and now he had to rebuild his life, starting from the very basics. But Mercedes, always wise and calm, reminded him of what was most important. It's not your fault, Augustin. We were both victims of her manipulations. You, like me, didn't see the truth. But the important thing is that now we know everything and we can move on. Talia no longer controls us, and that's what matters most. His eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of regret, they were tears of gratitude. He thanked her for always being there for him, for her support, for her incredible resilience. He didn't know how he would have coped without her. Mercedes was the person who not only survived that hell, but found the strength to move on. A few days later, after Talia was arrested, Augustin and Mercedes had a small meeting with the police. They discussed next steps, summarizing the whole story. Augustin sat in his chair feeling incredibly relieved, but at the same time he still felt heavy from how long it had all taken. We won, the policeman said as he approached them with the results of the investigation. All your evidence was key, and now Talia will be behind bars. We checked her connections, her background. It all corroborates your testimony. Now all we have to do is finalize the legal part and that will be the end of it. Mercedes nodded, but her face remained serious. She knew that justice would be served, but there was one thing she kept thinking about. They could win, but what would that change for their family? With Talia gone, would they still have a chance to get their lives back? I don't think she could fool us again, Augustin said, but there was still uncertainty in his voice. Maybe, Mercedes said, looking out the window, where the sunset lights of the city were beginning to show. But we've already been through the worst of it. And now I'm sure that we'll be stronger every day. The important thing is not to forget that we did it together. Soon all the official papers were signed, and Talia was transferred to the prison. Everything she had so carefully built up crumbled overnight. She was charged with a number of felonies that included fraud, theft, and threats and violence. The trial promised to be a long one, but it no longer mattered to Mercedes and Augustin. They knew that Talia would receive the punishment she deserved. With each new day, they began to return to their normal lives, rebuilding everything that had been destroyed. But one thing was important to Augustin: he was no longer the man who could quietly watch his mother suffer. Now he knew how to protect her and himself. No matter how this story ended, it was a fresh start for both of them. The beginning of a new chapter where there was no room for fear and manipulation. There was only room for the truth. A few months passed, and Augustin and Mercedes' lives finally began to rebuild. Although they had lost a lot by going through Talia's manipulations, they had gained the most important thing: each other. Everything that had happened in their lives now seemed like something distant to them, like a hazy memory not worth looking back on. Mercedes sat on the old couch, sighing with pleasure as she looked at the little changes they had made to the house. Augustin sat next to her, and they felt again that it wasn't just a house, it was their fortress, a place where they could be themselves. "You know, Mom, I think we need something for ourselves. I've lived for others for so long that I've forgotten how to live for myself." Augustin looked at her, smiling, but there was a slight sadness in his voice. Mercedes looked at her son and smiled, a wise look shining in her eyes. "You are not alone in this. We've always been together, but now that Talia isn't in control of our lives, we have a chance to start over. We need more than forgiveness, we need a new beginning. Let's do what's truly important to us." They both fell silent, but inside they knew that their lives did not end with this horrible phase. On the contrary, it was a new beginning, full of discovery, traveling, and laughter. Augustin knew that he was now able to be there for those who loved him and not be afraid of making mistakes. He realized that no matter how many times you fail, the important thing is to get up and keep going. Mercedes put her hand on his shoulder, as she had done so many times in their lives, and simply said, "We're together. And that's what matters." Talia's story was over, but her shadow would hang over their lives for a long time to come. For her, it was over. She has lost everything she once had, and despite her ambition and cunning, she has suffered the punishment she deserves. But for Augustin and Mercedes, it was a moment of new freedom, of realizing that they could control their own destiny. No manipulation, no threats could control them anymore. They had grown stronger, learned to trust each other and appreciate the present moments. Everything that had once seemed hopeless was now a bright prospect. It wasn't just a victory over Talia. It was a restoration of dignity, inner strength, and confidence that nothing could destroy their spirit. And with each passing day, as the house filled with laughter and their favorite foods appeared on the table, Augustin and Mercedes realized that all the struggle had been worth it. Not only had they found freedom, but they had found each other anew. Talia was a thing of the past, and in front of them was a new life, a life full of opportunity, love, and freedom. And no matter how life turned out, they knew they could handle anything, because now they had a family, and that was more important than anything else. Well, that's the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. Your comments are always important to us, so write what you think about the story and share your thoughts. We are always happy to hear what you think. I apologize for any mistakes that may be made, as everything is voiced live. But I hope you had fun and that this story touched on something important to you. Thank you for being with us. See you again.